Thank you, Emma. And thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. Um, and before I start, I'll just make a point about the structure of the videos, the video slides. So at the bottom left, there'll be the title, the subject matter, and the map and cartographer, if I know it. And I'm just pointing this out because I won't necessarily refer to all this information in any of the slides. So it's just to give a bit of background. And I'd like to begin actually with a quick overview of the technique that I use in much of the work that I'm showing today. And it's a transfer process by which a printed image is glued face down onto a sheet of heavy watercolor paper. You stick the printer face down and then wet the back, remove the paper, it's slowly rubbed off. And that just leaves the ink of the print. So even if you use the same image repeatedly, each transfer is sort of imperfect and individual, unlike the static fixed nature of the original image. And the physical process of pushing and peeling this paper off the back is kind of like an excavation, which brings the underlying image into view. And like the effect of time on memory, these images then become sort of changed, fragmented, as you can see here, or malleable. And while I've used this technique to create artworks in their own right, it's really come into its own when I've begun to use it as a ground for overdrawing. And I rarely reverse the original image so that when it's transferred, it's backwards, kind of like Leonardo's writings in his notebooks, or the world that Alice enters through the looking glass. And that's quite important to me when working with maps, because they have an inherent language that is both visual and textual. So a map that's reversed is still recognizable as a map and often as a particular map, but it changes your perception of it. You don't read it in the same way. And also as backgrounds, the process gives a worn and weathered appearance that really sort of suits the nature of the subjects that I eventually came to draw over them. So I'm going to go back in time a little to when I first became interested in this idea. Oh, I've skipped one. Oh, this is a disaster. I'm really sorry. I should be on this one. It's skipping a map. I'm really sorry about this. But I will forge ahead. I first became interested in the idea of mapping specimens during a process of research that took me to collections in a lot of different cities. And I came to realize that my visual research connected the subjects and objects in their locations in a particularly personal and entirely subjective way. So, for example, when I first visited London down here, I drew Isaac Newton's death mask and Babbage's brain. And then later I was in Philadelphia, where I saw the death mask of John Hunter, the founder of the Hunterian Museum, and also that of James Joyce. Now, I learned there that Joyce studied medicine in Paris, where I'd been the year before, and I'd been looking at the brains of Paul Broca's aphasic patients, which you can see here. And his research led to what's now known as Broca's area, which is a localized region in the brain that affects the ability to use language. So thinking about language, it occurred to me it was Joyce's phenomenal use of language that led him to abandon his medical studies and basically finish writing Ulysses in Paris. And in that book, each chapter is associated with a specific color, an art or a science, and a bodily organ. So this is me starting to think about ways of visualizing these ideas and the allure of the connections. And I started wondering about how to apply this in my practice. So these are some experiments where I have digitally interpolated my drawings onto maps of the cities that the specimens I've drawn reside in. And the map is from around the time that the museum there was founded. And these really are just very early experiments to see how streets and bones might work together, how they look. So I'm now just going to run through some of the work I've been doing since. Obviously, there's always been a great collaboration between anatomists and artists, which has been very well documented elsewhere. But one of the great works that's always inspired me is Andreas Vesalius's Anatomical Atlas, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. And the Fabrica was first published in 1543 and it was widely believed to have been illustrated by Titian's pupil, Jan van Kalker. And it's notable for its accurate depictions of anatomy based on direct observation of the dissection of the human body rather than on animals, as had often been the case with earlier anatomists. And I've been experimenting with this tableau, and particularly the muscle figures, of which you can see two here, that are posed in this sort of active fashion, standing and displaying their musculature against this background of a rolling Renaissance landscape. And it's actually only been recognized since about 1903 that the landscapes of the 14 plates could be linked to form a panorama. And it's believed to depict the region outside of Padua where Versailles was once the university's surgical lecturer. Now, I've been collaborating with an art historian, Dr. Glenn Harcourt, who's done quite a lot of work about Versailles, and we've been toying with the notion of exploring the world of Versailles anatomy through the eyes of a fictitious literary figure, the character of Alice in Wonderland, as illustrated by Tenniel. And this is one of the test pieces we made, which features several layers of transfer and drawing over the background of a double cordiform projection by Gerardus Mercator from 1538, which is only a little bit before the publication of the Fabrica itself. And Mercator was actually a contemporary of Vesalius's and fellow Belgian. Eventually, we hope to develop a series of 10 double pages, each one featuring an historical map relating to a location in Vesalius's life, one of the muscle figures, and related text and imagery exploring the relevance and continuing influence of the Fabrica today. Now, while the cordiform or heart-shaped projection originated in Ptolemy's early works, the development of a heart-shaped map projection during the Renaissance era was sort of no accident, because it reflected the belief that the heart was the symbol of the world, and it was related to the concept of your inner emotions affecting the physical outer world. Now, in this particular piece, the heart that overlaps both these pages is actually taken from a much later work from Gray's Anatomy, drawn by Henry Van Dyke Carter in the 1850s. So at this time, I've been working with maps as grounds for both overdrawing and as part of installation. And here again, you see Mercator's double cordiform, over which I've drawn a copy of another of the woodcuts from the Fabrica, a dissection of the brain. And the hands here are casts of my own hands, and the threads they hold come up out of the hair painted on this unfortunate part dissected head, which sort of connects me both to the image and to the map that it occupies. And there is a lens in the center here focusing on the brain, because to me it suggests that this organ, rather than the heart, was the center of the known world at the time. And here's another similar work. In this case, the background is the Universalis Cosmographia of 1507, which was by a German cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller, whose map, incidentally, was the first to actually give a name to America. So the skeletal articulated foot is direct drawn. And again, on either side are casts of my own hands, which you can see here in the close-ups. On the left, a hand holding a pencil, and on the right, a gloved hand holding a scalpel. Not a surgical scalpel, incidentally, but an artist's scalpel. And here, I like the way that the physical shadow of the scalpel matches the drawn shadow of the heel. It kind of blurs the bounds between an illustration of an image and the physical embodiment of something. And this work, if you look at it here with the corners cut off, was originally made to fit on a hospital trolley, which formed part of an installation seen here in the delightful darkness of the Undercroft in Norwich. And I took the title of this installation from Waldseemüller, but it also references the Cosmographia by Sebastian Münster from 1544. And his maps include Europe anthropomorphized as a queen, with her body made up of all the different countries of Europe. So this plays with the notion of the body, either in parts or whole, as a microcosm of the world, and also as the self as a fractured, anatomized, and subject to the medical gaze. Now, while I still select maps for their visual impact, I've been thinking more about the information that they embody and what this means for the specimens that I draw over them. I still choose old maps of the cities the museums are in, but not necessarily from the year that they were founded. Anatomical objects and specimens actually travel around between collections. So I've been moving away from the idea of connecting similar specimens in different cities, as I began with, and looking more at embedding objects from different places into the collections that they now reside. And this particular image was drawn during my first visit to the Anatomy Museum of the University of Edinburgh. And the skeleton's label says simply Irish male, followed by an accession number. And the other skulls in this cabinet are similarly labelled. This, however, is the remains of one William Burke, grave robber, murderer, who, along with his companion William Hare, supplied this very medical school with their useful and profitable cadavers for their increasing numbers of students. And the names actually have come to symbolize a practice that inspired others. For example, the less well-known but equally murderous London Burkers, or the Bethnal Green Gang. And these crimes eventually resulted in the change of law and the introduction of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which was an attempt to legitimize provision of bodies to the many medical schools across the nation. Now, while Hare turned Queen's evidence and disappeared, Burke was sentenced to be anatomized and now remains forever in the medical school to which he once sold his victims. But one thing that frustrates me about this particular drawing, which has been acquired by the University Museum, I can't find the exact map that I used here. And I've got quite a number of maps of Edinburgh. But it seems to me that his head rests on the castle mound and his spine sort of follows the course of the Royal Mile. Now, it's been important to me that I work in situ in the museum, and this has become more important than the age of the cartographer of the maps I use. And usually I'll paste up a number of maps of the place where I'm going to in advance, so I can then select the best one that suits the subjects I want to draw when I see it. And sometimes this isn't a particular city, it could be a county or a state, as with this image on the left. And I found the topography of Oregon here a really interesting counterpoint to the sketch of a Beauchene skull preparation in the anatomy lab at Oregon State University. A Beauchene is an exploded skull mount. And on the right is a study of a skull with Gorlin-Galt syndrome, also in Edinburgh from Surgeons Hall Museum. And I think that both these sort of mountainous topographies and the really grid-like streets act as quite a sort of compelling textures. And what's really enjoyable here is trying to tease out the drawing of the skull from this field of pattern and color. And I just want to look at another two. Just before lockdown last March, I was working in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. And these two studies are from a series of skulls in the Hurtle collection. The Mutter acquired this collection of 139 human skulls from Viennese anatomist Joseph Hurtle in 1874. And Hurtle's aim in collecting and studying them was to show the variation in cranial anatomy in the Caucasian population of Europe, which was an attempt to counter the pseudoscience of phrenology, which believed that the shape of your skull evidenced intelligence, criminality, or other personality traits. And they're all inscribed with information about the person's age, place of origin, and manner of death. And in these two, on the left here, you can see Veronica Huber. She was 18 years old, from Salzburg, and she was executed for the murder of her own child. On the left is Isidore Kostial, 46. He's a Pole from Galicia, and he died of phlebitis following a complicated fracture of the femur. Now, this is, it's incredible and actually quite unusual to have so much personal information on public display. And this work is kind of feeding into a part of my practice, which is drawing skulls as portraits in their own right, as they are now, mute and unchanging. Whether it's a Pole from Galicia now in Philadelphia, or an unnamed Roman girl in a box on a shelf in Ipswich Museum stores. But the subject I was really interested in the Mutter was this one I've drawn repeatedly on a previous visit. It's a human head in a spirit jar, tucked away on a shelf down in the wet room in the cold store where specimens not on display are kept. And I think you can see why I find it so compelling. The sagittal cut is clean and neat. But in contrast, the eye is quite crudely enucleated. What's hard to see in this image is the scattering of whiteheads on his cheek and the little tufts of stubble on his weak chin. And these small features of individuality are really very deeply affecting, as is the fact that he's plainly, despite the bleaching caused by the preserving fluid, he's plainly African American. And what we're looking at here is the visual distortion caused by the heavy glass of the squared jar that he's in, viewed from the front right corner. And in this sort of liminal space, you can simultaneously see both sides of him, the inner and outer worlds. The brain, upper spinal cord, tongue and sinus cavities sort of blur into his face and head, which is veined by the post roads marked on the map beneath. Now, in a museum that is full of disturbing and in some cases self-donated bodies, there is a poignancy and powerlessness to this half-head which really never wanes, and I can see why he's not on public display, but I'm really looking forward to finding out more about him in the future. And I'd like to sort of finish this presentation on a new work which for once isn't drawn over a map, and it also breaks my own rule about working from situ, from life in situ. But this piece isn't really part of my mapping canon. It's from a series painted from photographs during the last few months. So a COVID canon, or a lockdown canon, if you like. And I was painting this at the same time as I was writing this talk, not with any intent to actually include it, but I finished both at the same time, and it kind of seemed apt to consider it in the light of the cordiform projection I discussed earlier by Ptolemy. He proposed a geocentric model of the known universe with Earth at its center, as the heart was considered the center of the body. And I think that it could be construed a landscape. The morphogenesis that shapes these tissues also informs the mycelium of fungi, the forms of trees, the paths of rivers, or the organic pattern of footpaths and roads that eventually come to describe a city. Now, the chordae tendineae of the heart, literally the heartstrings, connect, cross, support, and bind like a net or network. And this nexus of veins, valves, neurons, and tendons might constitute a compact organic map, and one that we carry and consult at all times, wherever in the world we happen to be. So thank you very much, and apologies for the screen sharing issues.